Sorry. That's what is this? This is like the reverse parting of the Red Sea.
Yes.
You know, if you're on a ship, you'd capsize. No, it's okay.
I think everybody's
Jill, you have to sit on this side, though.
Yes, sir.
Good Lord. Okay, we're finally here. Couple of things. So we're going to start on quote unquote early church, which I warned you we're going to have to go back in time a little bit, which we will do. But I want to put out there the book that I'm using is a book that was my textbook when I took church history in seminary. And that probably sounds off-putting, as soon as you use the word textbook. But I promise it's actually it's a very fantastic book. I had my dad read it at one point in time. He borrowed it from me. I don't know if he actually read it or not. And I was totally bummed. So I was trying to find my copy of it. And I know that I have 2 copies because when I loaned the one to my dad, I immediately regretted it because he lives in Michigan, and it's hard to get things from Michigan to Oregon except through the mail. I'm not going to spend $30 to ship a book that costs $25. So I bought another copy of it, and I couldn't find either copy when I went looking for it. So I went to buy it off Amazon. But like, you ever doom scroll on Amazon? You know what I mean by that? Which is you enter in a search field. In this case, I couldn't remember the exact title of the book, so I just put early church history or early Christian history into the search field in Amazon, and then kept scrolling through it. It's one of those things where I knew what I was looking for, but I didn't know exactly what I was looking for. So I knew that I would recognize it when I saw the title. And I remembered that the author had a Central or South American name. It was kind of a Hispanic name. So I had all these little pieces in my head that I was looking for. And I kept trying to refine the search field by that. It was not working. But the thing is if it's a lesson in algorithms. If you enter something into Amazon search field and you keep scrolling down, or if you're on a phone, scroll down, you keep going to the next page, next page. It's always fascinating to see what you finally end up in. Especially if you're looking for books of a religious nature on Amazon. Because you have to remember, right, that anybody can put anything on Amazon. So it's the era of self-publishing, which is fascinating, by the way, absolutely fascinating. That anybody can get a book on Amazon, right? This is, gone are the days of celebrating because a publisher bought your book. Now if you want to self-publish something, it's literally as easy as uploading a PDF. That's about it. Quality be darned, right? So the problem is the further you go into something, the more and more that Amazon is trying to find what it thinks you want. But that's the important thing, not what you actually want, what it thinks you want, right? So it's based off the words you put in, it's based off of previous books that you read, believe it or not. And I think they probably wouldn't admit this, I think it's also based off of what you might have read in the news, because good Lord, it keeps track of everything. So I'm scrolling through, and early Christian history, right? That you wouldn't think you would be able to get that far with it, but you'd be shocked. 2 pages later, right? 3 pages later, right? So I hadn't even got in 2 pages, and I ended up with hold on, some of the names of these books. The True Christian History of America. Seems to be, if you play Mad Lib with those words, that seems like it might relate to my original search, but it's a significantly different book than the one that I'm looking for, right? And then you get all these wild cards. Like I got one, Liberalism, or How to Turn Good Men into Weenies, Whiners, and Wimps.
Surely that's...
All I want to know is what in Amazon's algorithm made it think that this was in any way related. But here's what I think it is. I think as soon as you put the word Christian, and this is an unfortunate commentary on our society, but as soon as you put the word Christian into the Amazon search field, it automatically assumes your political meaning, right? And I'm not necessarily betraying my political meaning here. I'm just saying it thinks it knows what you're looking for, right? That's what these scary algorithms do, right? And it got worse. I'll just, spoiler alert. It got worse the further I went into it, and it was funny because it kept refining for that type of literature. But again, it's the world of self-publishing, is that there are so many books out there now that anybody with an opinion can put out there, and all you need to do is have a cover that gives it a sheer of the near of legitimacy, right? It's kind of a scary world that we live in.
So did you ever find your book?
I did, and not through Amazon. I gave up on Amazon, and I went and I did Google instead, right? Who is still trying to sell me something, but they're not trying to sell me something. Their sponsored advertisers are trying to sell me something. That one degree of separation makes a difference. But I also refined my search field by putting the word textbook into the tagline.
I was going to say,
Yeah.
Name the publisher.
But I couldn't remember the stinking publisher either, right? And that's the problem too, is there aren't so many. There's several publishers that do produce like actual journal, scholarly theological books. Like there's Zondervan, there's Penguin Publishing actually does quite a bit of stuff. I can't remember who this one is. Anyways, all that to say, the book. I did. Oh, I found my book. The book that we're using is The Story of Christianity, Volume 1. If you're interested, because you can also get it on Audible if you do that kind of thing. And there are 2 volumes, not like 50. So this is Volume 1. And Volume 1, it's a fairly long book, which is represented by the fact that this goes all the way from Jesus to Luther, right? So this covers all the way from the beginning of Christianity up to the Reformation, which again seems like a pretty broad scope. It actually makes sense though, because there's a lot that goes on from Jesus to Constantine, and then not a lot besides the Crusades up until around the turn of the millennium. And the author is Cusco. That's an S and that's an O. Gonzalez. Yeah, he is from South America. And he's a graduate of Emory University, I think, which is in Georgia, which is a very prestigious Bible school. One of my colleagues ended up becoming a professor at Emory, which all of my friends were extremely jealous of, because that was kind of the sweet gig, getting a job at Emory. Believe it or not, I have several friends that ended up going on to become professors of religion, which is about, the joke about, oh, you wanted to get a job at Starbucks? That's that joke, right? Getting a doctorate in the field of religion is tough, because there just aren't that many schools anymore that employ people with professional degrees, and because of kind of the political dividing line, it's a 50-50 split over which schools you're going to work at. I can explain that more. But so I've got two friends, Anna and Ryan, who I've mentioned before. Anna's working at Luther now. Ryan is still finishing his doctorate. So they got into that world. And Anna and a guy named Michael Chan, who got the job at Emory, were competing colleagues when we were in seminary. And so Anna was super jealous of Michael. Anyway. No, they would not work at Liberty University or Oral Roberts. I mean, Oral Roberts is not. Or anything that ends with the word Bible school. That's not entirely true. The problem is so if you see a school, a university or college that ends in the words Bible school, we tend to think that I tend to see that through the lens of it's an evangelical. But in reality, there is a whole and we talked about this when we studied the history of Christianity. Baptism is a legitimate. This sounds so silly, but the Baptist, and it's not really a denomination anymore, but the world of baptism is a very legitimate, mainline, however you want to use that term, denomination. It's the largest denomination in the United States of America. baptism and its derivatives, and has a very rigorous academic theological tradition. So Bible school is a tagline that you'll see for a lot of Baptist seminaries and universities. It just so happens that because of that legitimacy that name lends it, other schools and forms thereof will copy that name. Well, we're getting into the weeds. But anyways, this is the book, The Story of Christianity, Volume 1 by Justo Gonzalez. It is available on Amazon in Kindle form as well. I got the Kindle version, so I can never lose it until the world ends. I no longer have access to my digital library. And I got it on Audible as well too, which is great because I read it and then I go back and listen to it while I'm walking. It's a good way to internalize stuff. Okay, so we're going to go back in time. The scope of what we covered when we talked about the apostles was essentially the end of Jesus' ministry to the death of the apostles. We need to go back because we need to kind of set the stage for where Christianity comes out of. Some of this stuff is stuff that we've talked about, but it's kind of helpful to put it all together in one basket and look at it too, right? Okay. So we're going to go all the way back actually to the end of the exile. Okay. So here's the history of the nation, of the people, of the Hebrew people, the people of Israel in a nutshell. Is the nation of Israel as a single unified entity does not exist very long. It exists for the scope of 3 kings. Okay. Saul, David, and Solomon. When Solomon dies, his son takes over. His son's a jerk, just like Solomon was. It's a different story. The kingdom splits into 2, into the northern kingdom, now called Israel, and the southern kingdom, now called Judah. What's interesting about this is that if you remember, Israel, before it was a nation, was a conglomeration, confederation of 12 tribes. And those 12 tribes were named after the 12 sons of Israel. Yeah, 12 sons of Israel, the 12 sons of Jacob. And the biggest of those tribes was Judah. Judah was the largest in terms of geographical area. Judah is where Jerusalem is. Judah becomes now the single southern kingdom of Israel. The other 11 tribes, quote unquote, become the northern kingdom. Now those tribal affiliations are much less strong than they were perhaps under the reign of Saul, right? Because that's what Saul does. Saul essentially unifies the 12 tribes of a single nation. When the kingdom divides, those tribal identities still exist, right? Because that was I remember all this. I might be harkening back to a memory that exists uniquely in my head, but if you recall when we studied the story of David, that's one of the main conflicts is David having to struggle against tribal identity because David comes from Benjamin, I think. Can't remember which tribe he comes out of. But that tribal identity still exists in terms of almost a north-south divide, similar to the north-south divide that exists in this country and still affects our politics. It still existed in Israel. Okay. So when the 2 nations do divide, it's kind of across those tribal lines. I'm going to go faster now. So the northern kingdom exists as an entity for not very long, about 200 years, until it's conquered by the empire of Assyria to the east. And what we've talked about before is that there are always kind of like these two empires. It's the empire to the northeast and the empire to the southwest that Israel finds itself sandwiched between. It's kind of an east-west, north-south divide. Something to remember that's very important, I'm going to flip this around real quick, is that the reason that Israel finds itself sandwiched between 2 empires is because Israel is a crossroads. So we have Israel right here. This is a similar map, but a little bit more blown up. But Israel is a crossroads of many roads, actually. Israel is a crossroads from north-south, so from the Arabian Peninsula up to Asia Minor. Okay, so you've got trade routes passing through there. It's also an east-west crossroads. So you've got traders from Spain and what is now Spain, France, and Portugal that are coming through the Mediterranean to ports in Israel and then heading east, right, towards parts unknown, towards Southeast Asia. So what this means is that Israel is of great value, right? The other piece of it is that Israel also has access to fresh water in the Sea of Galilee, meaning that this area up here is a very arable land. It's very farmable. Contrasted with the south of Israel, which is not. It's almost all desert. Okay? So everybody wanted control of Israel in one way or another. For Assyria, that meant gaining control of the northern part of Israel. They didn't really care too much about Jerusalem, but also they were butting heads with the Empire of Egypt, which existed at that time, right? So this was kind of a not a DMZ, but it was a no man's land, so to speak. So Assyria conquers the northern kingdom, gains access to that farmable land there, calls it quits, says they're done there. Judah, for the next 150, 200 years, is essentially a vassal state of Egypt. Okay, they side with the Egyptians, hoping that will stave off the impending, or the ravening hordes of the people to the east. A big power shift takes place not too about 100 years after the fall of the Northern Empire, in that Assyria is conquered from within, essentially, by the Babylonians, what become known as the Babylonians. So Babylon becomes the new power to the east under the heading of Nebuchadnezzar, one of the best names ever, Nebuchadnezzar. And Babylon becomes that new threat to Jerusalem. So after the northern kingdom, the southern kingdom of Judah exists for another 150, 200 years until they're conquered by Babylon. Okay? And that story is one of the stories that is front and center, core and fundamental to understanding the identity of the Jewish people. Right? It's the exile. That is the story. So when Jerusalem is conquered, the temple is destroyed, the people are moved, some of them are moved from Jerusalem east to Babylon. And there they spend the next 70-odd years in exile and functional slavery as servant peoples to the Babylonians. Okay? This also, the exile in its entirety, is fundamental to the identity of the Hebrew people. Okay? What happens next? Another new power arises out of the east in the form of the Persians. So the Persian Empire, under the head of Cyrus, conquers now the Babylonian Empire. Cyrus, now taking control of these people that have been absorbed by the Babylonian Empire, doesn't want them anymore for various reasons. One of the interesting things about the Hebrew people is they are the worst vassal states. They are the worst, not subjective, subjects ever. They're a thorn in everyone's side. We'll talk about why a little bit later, because their relationship with Rome is hilarious in a lot of ways. So Cyrus conquers Babylon, sends the Hebrew people back to Jerusalem, funds the reconstruction of the temple. Right. So this is another big identity piece for the Hebrew people: is the temple is the home of God. It is Bethel, right? It is the home where God is. And we can talk about the theology and the significance of that or we can talk about it today too, but I cannot understate, or I cannot overstate the importance of the temple in the mindset of the Hebrew people, because this actually becomes one of the major sources of conflict that exists during Jesus' time, that defines the Jewish people. Is, are we a people of the building, or are we a people of the book? Cyrus funds the rebuilding of the temple. Cyrus has a great empire that is later conquered by one of the greatest empires and one of the briefest empires of humanity, which is headed by who played Colin Farrell, right? Anybody see the mover? Alexander the Great. Okay, Colin Farrell played Alexander in the Hollywood version of it, which was awful. So Alexander the Great, from where?
Macedonia.
Thank you. From Macedonia. He is not Greek. He's from Macedonia, but heads the Greeks. That's a big thing. So his dad, I think his dad's name is Philip. Ironically, yeah, Philip of Macedon. I think that's right. Not Mastodon, Macedonia. different thing. Yeah.
I read that the United States fundamentalist Christians
Cyrus.
And it's because Cyrus rebuilt the temple. Is that the good that he did?
Mm.
You know, a flawed person, but accomplished something good.
Yes, that is true. That is a comparison that was made in the justification that it was used. But that's like saying that apples and fire are similar because they're both red. It's a very, okay, this is going to sound, well, it is. It's very biased and arrogant, but it's a very poorly informed, both theologically and historically, comparison. Because, yes, Cyrus absolutely did fund the rebuilding of the Second Temple, which was destroyed, by the way, 300 years later. So, I mean, I don't know what point they're trying to make there, right? Cyrus also he was actually a pretty decent ruler overall. He wasn't an evil person. I don't know about his relationship with women or, their sexual autonomy. He was a man of the 3rd century BCE. He was also very violent, right? Cyrus and his successors attempted several times to unify the world by military power, right? The Persian War is one of the most famous wars in the history of humanity, right?
300.
All 300. All of our great stories come out of the Persian War, but that wasn't Cyrus. That was Xerxes. That was one of his. I don't know if that was his story, or Darius, and then Xerxes, whatever. Doesn't matter. Well, it does, but not for today. But yeah, I remember that comparison being made, but it's not that this matters, but it's not a very intellectually inspiring or sound comparison. And considering the things that it's trying to justify, I don't think holds any cards. So Alexander the Great comes through, conquers most of the known world. I'm sure you've seen maps of the territory that he covers in a very brief amount of time, right? Theoretically a military genius. I think he was just lucky.
Well, that and elephants.
That and elephants. Yeah, that does help. That's more not Hammurabi. That's
you're right.
Hannibal. Thank you.
Yeah.
Bringing the elephants across the what's the mountain range? Yeah, Alps.
Yeah.
Yeah, Hannibal. Different time period. But yeah, there were elephants as well. So Alexander conquers most of the known world, dies relatively young, leaves his empire in 4 pieces. Right? It goes to his 4 generals, sons, something like that, with the idea that they'll have to manage it together, but in reality, it immediately splinters into 4 separate factions, which then slowly over time dwindle into great, until the next big power comes on the scene, which is the Romans. Okay. And this is what's relevant. Now, we're not just talking about this because history is interesting, although it is very interesting, but that's my bias. We're talking about it because this has an impact on the Hebrew people. Insofar as that up until Alexander the Great comes on the scene, we're mostly talking about Mesopotamia, right? We're mostly talking about the peoples that come out of this valley. Well, that's a bit of a generalization, but come out of, the breadbasket of the world, the area between the Tigris and the Euphrates, which this is a bit of a gross generalization, but relatively speaking, this is not that's necessarily an ethnicity, but these are our people who have a shared history, right? So this is the cauldron of humanity that Abraham comes out of. This is the cauldron of humanity that the Persians come out of, that the Egyptians come out of. Suddenly, onto the scene comes the Hellenistic influence. Okay, so these peoples not from the desert world. I'm still pointing as if there's a map up here. So imagine there is. Not come out of the world of desert, right, which is Egypt and Arabia and Syria and Persia. They come from Greece, the area of the Mediterranean. They come from Rome, Italy, as far west as France, modern day nations. Okay, and what they bring with them is they bring with them new language, which is important, but also new ways of thinking, okay? This is one of those things that it's really hard for Westerners to understand, really, is the significance of the differences in the ways of thought, right, that really come together during this period of history. And I'm not going to try to characterize the modes of philosophy and thought and theology that exist in the Near East in ancient times. If you want to know more about that, read the Bible. I mean, it's one of the few resources we have. Even read the Quran is a great way to kind of understand the mindset and the philosophy of those peoples. But now we've got new players coming onto the scene. Players like Socrates and Plato, right? These names that we take for granted in terms of our own philosophy, right? We as Westerners trace our philosophical underpinnings back to these dudes, right? Back to classics, the classics. Why are they the classics? I don't know. But they claimed it first, right? They get to be the classics. I've been talking for a while, okay? Any students of the classics, anybody that's read Socrates or Plato or, yeah, I mean, kind of that's where we're all at, right? You got to be very careful if you claim to be a classicist. I have a friend who teaches at Reed College. She's not a classicist. She's a post-revolutionary or early American history professor, history is so niche, it's so funny. But she has friends who are classicists, and they are interesting. I've met some of them. They are interesting people. But it's a world that's been studied significantly, and not just historically, but the foundations of our modern philosophy you can trace all the way back there. So these guys come onto the scene, both literally and figuratively. Okay. Hellenism is a cultural force that now is mixed into the sea of the pot of humanity that lives in the Near East, specifically, which is relevant to us today, in Israel. Okay, and what's interesting is how the Hebrew people, how the Jewish people interact with Hellenism. Okay, and it's predictable because it's similar to how anybody reacts to new influences, external influences that are impressing themselves upon your culture and your thought and your religion, okay? Which is to say that some people try to reject them entirely, right? It's foreign, it's outside, we don't want to deal with it, it's bad, it's evil because it's from our oppressors, right? But some people, in fact, a lot of people attempt to reconcile like Hellenistic, Greek philosophy with Hebrew theology. One of those guys, which we're not going to talk at length about, but it's interesting to know the name, is Pliny. I love this name. Pliny of Nope.
No.
He's later. He's a Christian. This is Pliny of Alexandria. And Pliny of Alexandria, I know, Pliny the Younger, that's.
I like that, the name.
It is. It's a great name, and that will win you the trivia game 9 times out of 10. Right? Okay, good. This guy is the lesser known, Pliny of Alexandria, or maybe Pliny the Lesser, just like James the Lesser. But what Pliny of Alexandria does is Pliny tries to reconcile the Bible, which is kind of, in a lot of ways, the sum total of Hebrew philosophy and theology. He tries to reconcile the Hebrew Bible with Hellenism, with specifically Socratism and Greek philosophy. And I'm not going to do a real good job of painting this out. If you want to know more, go read a book about Pliny of Alexandria or Greek philosophy. But kind of the connections that he attempts to draw is how these classic Greek philosophers all were aspiring towards the ultimate, right? So they talked sometimes about an ultimate being, sometimes they talked about an ultimate existence, the existence that exists beyond the flesh and blood that we see here. I can't remember, was it Plato that the ideals, the world of ideals? Yeah. So Pliny looks at that and he says, well, that's what we're talking about, right? We have a belief in the ultimate, the supreme existence, who we refer to as God, as Adonai. We don't use the tetragrammaton, we don't name his name. But also, we as a community are aspiring to the ultimate. We're aspiring to the eschaton, to the fulfillment of all things. So we're not going to get too deeply into this, but the reason this is important to know is that this is happening in the 3rd century BCE. So more than 200 years before Jesus. And what this means is that the Hebrew people, even before Jesus comes on the scene, are already beginning to think differently than they did before, right? Hellenism has done its work. The Hebrew people have encountered these new ways of thinking and are already beginning to incorporate them into the way that they think. And one of the things that comes out of this is this idea that monotheism, right, isn't just for us. Okay? In other words, Pliny is exploring this idea that the God of the Hebrew people might have more to do than just with the Hebrew people, right? If Yahweh, if the divine is after all the ultimate, the supreme being that we write about in our story, well, maybe he's got a bigger scope than just us. And the argument that he makes relatively unsuccessfully, because nobody really pays too much attention to him, is that the Greek people could benefit from a relationship with God. Sort of. That's a rough thing. Okay. So that's 3rd century. The other effect, well, one of many other effects that Hellenism has on the Hebrew people is on their society and their politics. Okay. As I mentioned, the Hebrew people struggle with what do we do with this, right? And it's complex, it's complicated because it isn't just about thought and philosophy, it's also about the reality, right? Which is that the Hebrew people now find themselves a subject of yet another power, which is the Roman Empire. Okay? And one of the big questions that arises in their politics is how do we relate to the Roman Empire? Right? And this is what brings us into where we're finally getting to Jesus, which is the politics that exist in Jesus' day. We were talking about this when we were talking about disciples, but remember our different political movements that exist, which is the Sadducees, because they're so sad, you see, and the Pharisees, you see, yeah, and the Essenes, which doesn't rhyme and isn't in that song, and the Zealots. And I mentioned before the Herodians. The Herodians are really they are part of this, sort of. The Herodians are specifically, it's kind of a subset of people who characterize themselves on their allegiance to Herod the Great, right? The great builder. Who, Herod the Great would be a Sadducee, hardcore. Because the Sadducees are essentially the nobility of the Hebrew people. Okay, they're the remnant of the nobility. Right, so who would these people have been before, right? So before Babylon, before all this. Well, the Sadducees would like to trace their lineage essentially back to the Levites, right? So the priestly caretakers of Israel, the people who carry the law on the tablets, in the box, in the ark, right? That theoretically sits in the temple, but we can never find it until Indiana Jones. But also, they're the caretakers of the building, of the temple, which, no, I'm not going to care. I was going to say it seems rather kind of like small worldish, but and again, I cannot overstate the importance of the temple into Hebrew thought. Right, the destruction of the temple was the end of their world. Right, both times that it happened. And it's not just about a big building either. It's a much more complex issue. We're not going to necessarily unpack that entire thing today. But all this to say that the Sadducees saw themselves as the ones, and again, they were the nobility. They were the privileged, for the most part, the wealthy. They were the ones that had power handed down to them generation to generation. They could literally trace their lineage back to David, right? And this is why when we read about Jesus, it's such an important thing that he has a genealogy that harkens back to David. Claiming a lineage to David is claiming temporal authority, right? So the Sadducees, temporal authority, history of power and wealth, but more importantly, these are the guys that made sure that the core identity of the Hebrew people never got lost, right? They've been holding on to that core across wars, across numerous conquests, across exile, across the destruction of the temple. They've been holding on to it. And I point this out to kind of humanize these folks. It's really easy to kind of characterize them as sticks in the mud and wealthy, kind of the way that in our modern era we struggle with the identity of the wealthy white man. But I don't want to rule them out so easily or to dehumanize them. I want to try and understand their motivations a little bit. What this means is that in a real way, these guys are the poster child of Jewish conservatism, right? And let's not confuse, those words in terms of our modern understanding of conservatism. But they're it, okay? And the Romans love these guys, okay? The Romans absolutely adore the Sadducees. And the reason being is that they have some shared values, okay? These guys like buildings. Well, they like a building, okay? But if you think about what brings the Roman Empire together in a lot of ways, so we use the word civilization, right? But you could make an argument that's synonymous with cityfication, right? In other words, what the Roman Empire was interested in doing was, yes, expanding boundaries, but expanding civilization in the forms of public works as far as they possibly could, which was great for humanity in general, was absolutely a net positive, right? The Romans would bring in money, they'd bring in engineering, they would bring in know-how, they would bring in manpower, and they would make your city better than it was. They would bring in access to fresh water, many times, access to hygiene that did not exist for you prior to this. They'd bring access to education, they'd bring access to safety, right? We cannot overstate the value of safe roads, safe seas, and the ability to travel from one end to the other.
I was reading about Libya yesterday, and
yes.
The Romans, of course, were there and built roads and buildings and dams. And in subsequent dynasties, whoever they might be, down in centuries, one big group of people came in and repaired the Roman roads, the dams, and all that.
What's remarkable is that Roman architecture is some of the most long-lasting, durable stuff. So my wife's family, they're kind of spread out now, but at one point were centered in the southeast of France. And so her parents' home is in Comps, which is near Avignon, which is famous because that was one of the homes of the papacy for a very brief amount of time. But in southeast France, near the Mediterranean, are tons of Roman ruins. If you wanted to just see Roman ruins, you could spend years and years and years. In fact, this was the moment where I knew I wasn't in Kansas anymore, which is we were at my wife's parents' house, and she says to me, "Do you want to go on a hike?" I'm like, "Yeah, where are we going to go?" She's like, "Well, we're going to go see some Roman ruins." I'm like, "Okay, great. Well, how long of a drive is it?" She's like, "No, it's right behind my parents' house. There's literally a Roman aqueduct that runs right behind where her parents lived, and you could hike up there." And here was the profound thing: is the aqueduct was in great shape. The 13th century monastery that was at the top of the hill was basically just rubble. So like you can't. I mean, again, I cannot overstate just what would the world be like had the Roman Empire not collapsed. Man, I don't know. I don't know if it would be good, but it would be clean. That's for sure. So this is the Romanizing influences. They bring all this stuff in. They like buildings. So do these guys. They like stability. So do these guys, right? They like wealth and power and authority. So do these guys, right? And so the Sadducees, in their thinking, and I'm really taking liberties here, right? I don't know what the Sadducees actually thought, but I'm conjecturing. The Sadducees, in their thinking, looked at the situation that they were in and looked at the history of their nation. We've always been under somebody's thumb. This isn't too bad a thumb to be under, right? And in fact, they're interested in the sanctity of our building. They want to make sure the temple sticks around. In fact, they're going to help us make it look pretty. What could go wrong with that, right? This is great. So why would we take any beef with the Romans, right? This works out extremely well. We've got the temple, we've got our identity as the Hebrew people. Let's go with this. These guys disagreed. Okay. Sort of, right? The idea that these are two fighting political parties like we have today is an oversimplification, okay? Because the reality is these guys were a tiny percentage of the population. This was about 90% of the population during Jesus' era. And these were not two necessarily at war political parties. These are two kind of different schools of thought. But I can guarantee you that there were Pharisees that came from land and money and wealth, right? That were probably effectively Sadducees, but were following kind of the Pharisaic identity. What characterized this? We talked about it already. What characterized the Pharisaic identity was an emphasis on the law, right? They were very, very, very intent on the keeping of the law. But it didn't need to be housed in a temple, okay? The law now didn't become the sole responsibility of the people, the Levites, right? The priestly class. It was now the responsibility of the whole people of Israel for the keeping of the law, right? So it's almost kind of a populist movement in a lot of ways, right? This is all of our responsibilities. It was at times also very nationalistic as well. Okay, these guys were okay with the Romans being there. It didn't matter. We got our building, right? We've got our power and wealth. No, we are Hebrew people. We are different because of what we do. Okay, and the Romans are keeping us from being all that we could be. Right?
When you said earlier that the Hebrews were really poor subjects, is that related to this?
Absolutely. Absolutely. So the Hebrew people were really poor subjects. One of the pieces of history that we skipped over, which we talked about briefly a couple weeks ago, was the Maccabean revolt, which was arguably a quite successful revolt. You can read all about it in the book of Maccabees. It's very fascinating. So Judas Maccabeus successfully raises up the Hebrew population. In Jesus' time, this is a good segue, what we get then. So these guys were philosophically opposed. I need a new color because that one's drying out. These guys were violently opposed to the well, I just need to be better at putting cats back. These guys are violently opposed. Okay. You could argue that this is an extreme radical wing of the Pharisaic movement. But again, I want us to get away from thinking of this in terms of like Democrats or Republicans. It's not it. This is a sea change, overall populist transformation that's taking place. Okay.
It's almost theological, is it not more than?
Yes, theological, but it's the Pharisaic movement is happening to the whole Hebrew people. Okay. This begins as soon as Alexander the Great comes on the scene. You can argue that the Pharisaic movement is the direct result of the Hellenization of the Hebrew people. Okay? And we can talk philosophically about that.
The tradition of scholarly dispute about the Talmud.
Yep.
Does that come after the Hellenistic?
So, yes. So the Pharisaic movement, and this is interesting to think about. So they're interested in keeping the law, okay? They're interested in everybody keeping the law. But what's the kind of unique problem that arises in that? It's, Martin Luther had to deal with the same thing. What's the law, right? It's interpretation. When these guys keep the law, the temple is the sole authority. The Levites are handing down the history of law and its interpretation from generation to generation. It goes all the way back to Moses. Okay. These guys introduced the idea of like, well, we all need to keep the law, but when you do that, then you run into situations that the law didn't anticipate. Okay? So it's about interpretation. So what happens is the Pharisaic movement is essentially the core of Judaism that survives then the Jewish Roman wars. So we're jumping ahead a little bit, but that's okay. 70, 80, Common Era, war begins in 66 or 68, the temple falls in 70, which kind of signals the end of Judaism as it existed prior to that. It certainly signals the end of the Sadducees. Okay, these guys essentially are wiped out, not physically, but philosophically, with the fall of the Second Temple. Okay, Pharisaism is now the identity, more or less, of the Jewish people, but it transforms. As with all conflicts, it causes transformation, and it becomes Rabbinic Judaism.
Yeah, what year do you call Rabbinic Judaism? Is it post-70?
Yeah.
Okay.
And it's not in 70. So Rabbinic Judaism really doesn't come about until the 3rd century. I don't know. I studied the rise of Christianity, not Judaism. But Rabbinic Judaism comes straight out of Pharisaic Judaism. Okay? And Rabbinic Judaism is essentially just the evolution of this, wherein this is all about interpretation, right? But it's kind of a mixed field at that point. And what rise up are essentially teachers, people who claim authority in doing that interpretation. And we could argue that Jesus is a manifestation of that, right? So in fact, Jesus is referred to as Rabboni, right, as rabbi, as teacher. It meant a different thing in Jesus' time than it did later. Okay, so rabbis come out of the same tradition that Jesus essentially is deriving some of his teaching authority from. If that makes sense. Does that compute? Okay. Got 7 minutes. That's perfect. Perfect. I'm sorry. This is a bit of an information dump today. There will be much more conversation in the weeks to come. But like I said, we had to do some catch up. Okay. Hellenization is one of 2 main factors that affect the Jewish people, the Hebrew people, and that informs who the Hebrew people are when Jesus comes on the scene. The other main thing that affects the Hebrew people is, I forget this word every time, and I don't know why. Do your brains just have like blank spots in them for specific words? Like I know this word. I know. Hold on, I'll get it here in a second. You will know it as soon as I say it. Oh, it was almost there. This is embarrassing. Diaspora. Holy cow. Jeez Louise. Diaspora. Okay. Diaspora is kind of a loaded term in that, and maybe this is just the way I think about it. When I hear the word diaspora, I immediately think about what happened after the destruction of the Second Temple, right after 70 AD, and in terms of the Hebrew people scattering to the world. And to be fair to me, it's been used that way. But the diaspora actually happens much earlier than that. In fact, the diaspora begins to happen with the destruction of the First Temple. Okay, wherein after the kind of centralizing part of Hebrew culture, which was Jerusalem, is destroyed, those that weren't taken to exile in Babylon, essentially move, right? Okay, let's not sit in the same place anymore. if like, I don't want to, well, I was going to make a joke about like never striking the same place twice, but it doesn't work. But this is further heightened by the arrival of Rome. Okay, Because when you have economic growth, when you have safe travel, when you have roads, and you now have the beginning of a unification of language, right? Because that's one of the things that does happen, is that the Romans are more than happy to teach people to speak Greek, right? Your kids can absolutely go to that school. Is that this is opportunity for the people living in Israel and in that area to get the heck out of Dodge, right? And so what you get happening as far back as the 4th and 3rd century BCE is you get Jews that move out of Israel. They get out of there. And they go everywhere. They go as far as Rome. They go all over the world, right? It's wherever opportunity and things can take them. And what Rome provides, more than anything, is it provides opportunity, right? Rome, I've got time for this? Yeah, 3 minutes. Okay. Rome has two main motivations. Well, we'll get to the second one. But here's the big one. Unity. Okay? Unity. Okay. So when Rome conquers a territory, right, what do? Well, they come in, yeah, they build roads, yeah, they build buildings, they do all those things. But they also do more than that. They bring education. They bring a new way of thinking, a new way of approaching the world. But also, they don't care what religion you are. They absolutely do not care. Because here's the other thing that motivates the Roman Empire. Syncretism. Have you heard that word? Syncretism. The blending of religions. The way that Rome approaches this is complex and simple in that they've got their pantheon, right? Which, jokingly is just a carbon. They control C, paste, but with different format. Sorry, I already lost by it. The Greek pantheon, right? So they took the existing Greek pantheon and they gave new names to it, essentially. But the other thing that they do is that every time they encounter a new people, they absorb their gods too. They're like, oh, you've got a god of the harvest? So do we. Right? You've got a god of the sea? So do we. You've got a god of the sky and lightning and thunder? So do we. Right? You guys are more than welcome. Right? They have no interest in changing your religion. So what this means is that for the Jews, right, who eventually this actually creates conflict, they don't have to be afraid of going anywhere within Rome. They're not going to be persecuted for being Jewish any more than the Ethiopians are going to be persecuted for being Ethiopian or the Egyptian, whatever, it doesn't matter. Okay? So I shouldn't have erased diaspora. 1044, one thing. Okay. So one of the major influencing factors on the Hebrew people and major influencing factors in the rise of Christianity is that when Christianity begins to spread its message, they are not bringing new people to new places. They're bringing a new message to people that already are in these places, right? So there are already Jews living in Rome. There are already Jews living in Philippi, living in the 7 churches, in Asia Minor. All around the Roman Empire are Jews that have left Israel. So when we begin talking about the spread of Christianity, one of the misconceptions that we often operate under is that it's the same way that we spread Christianity, during our colonizing era. Us and Western Europe, is that we encountered heathens, and I'm using that word pejoratively, right? It's an awful word. But we encountered the unenlightened and we brought enlightenment to them. That's not the way that Christianity spread in the 1st and 2nd and 3rd centuries. It spread from Jews to Jews. Okay? Christianity, for its 1st century, is not a Christian movement. It's a Jewish movement. Okay? It's not a new thing. It is a Jewish thing. It is a messianic movement within Judaism. So it's spreading from Jewish community to Jewish community. Paul does not found the church in Rome. The church in Rome exists. Paul simply writes letters to it. In fact, this is one of the major misconceptions about Paul in general. Paul is not a church planter, right? He may have planted churches, but that's not what he does. Paul is a church administrator. Paul writes letters to churches in conflict. Paul writes theological treatises helping people navigate this new world of Christianity, this changing Jewish movement, and Paul speaks authoritatively into that, helping them understand what it means to be people who follow Jesus. But they aren't people that Paul brought there. They're people that might have moved there 400 years ago, right? Their parents and their parents' parents and their parents' parents' parents have been in Rome all this time. And why is this important? Because Paul's one of those people, right? Paul is from Tarsus. His family is a family that left Israel at some point, right? Became, if not religiously, at least in their identity, Greek/Roman. And Paul points to that. He points to his Jewishness, but he also points to his Gentile, his Greek nature, as one of the things that allows him to be an authority in this growing world.
So the Jews in these various communities, did they just meet in their homes, or did they establish any sort of structures?
We'll get to that.
Okay.
They absolutely built structures. Spoiler alert. Yeah, we'll cross that bridge when we get there. Okay, folks. Thanks. I ran a little bit long. So next week, what we're going to do is we've covered all the backup. We're going to kind of jump ahead to Jesus, if that makes sense. Looking forward to seeing y'all next week. See you in worship.
Again, leave the table and chairs on in a little while.
Yeah, that would be nice. Yeah.
It's, I used to teach religion, and the thing about Alexander is taught him this little thing, which is 3, 2, 3, death of Alexander. 3, 2, 3. And I see kids, like I saw one, the daughter of one of the